Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and welcome back to the series where I am going through the entire MCU timeline. If you have not seen part 0 and want to know the logistics of this entire project, please go back and watch that video before jumping into this one. Without further ado, let's jump into part 1 of this timeline, Flashbacks and Origins. Our timeline begins billions of years ago before the universe even existed, where the beings known as the Celestials used their power to create galaxies and eventually universes. Around this time is when a certain Celestial known as Ego comes into existence. He doesn't really know where he came from, but over many years he is eventually able to form a body and eventually his own planet. This brings us to 13.8 billion years ago, where the Big Bang occurs. This is the event that when the Celestials create the Milky Way galaxy, that the universe expands out into existence, and from this event, it also sends 6 elemental crystals hurtling across the universe. These are the Infinity Stones, stones of incredible power that literally have the ability to control reality itself, or control existence, I should say. This brings us to millions of years ago, where the Celestials have a plan in order to create more Celestials or birth more Celestials, where they plant seeds inside of planets, and when these planets gain enough life, a Celestial will emerge out of the planet, which allows many more planets to be formed, except those planets end up dying. In order to protect life on these planets, the Celestials at their world forge create beings known as the Deviants, these creatures that are meant to protect all life on these planets. However, the Deviants end up turning on the Celestials and start killing everyone on the planets to prevent the emergences. Therefore, the Celestials correct by going back to the World Forge and creating beings known as the Eternals, beings that look very similar to humans but are actually androids that are sent to different planets to protect the life on those planets from the Deviants, so that the emergence can happen. The Eternals, however, are kept in the dark about the emergence, and after each emergence mission they complete, their memories are erased so that they can never know too much about the future know much about their missions when they go to different planets. This brings us to 2.5 million years ago, in which a meteorite filled with a rare ore named vibranium crashes onto the planet of Earth, specifically in the continent of Africa. When it hits the ground, the ore ends up enriching the soil around it, creating vibranium and all of these different plant lights across the continent. Eventually, many years later, the tribes that settled on this land ended up fighting over control of the vibranium, but then one man named Bashanga gets led to the heart-shaped herb by the panther god Bast, and when he takes the heart-shaped herb, he becomes the first Black Panther. He unites the tribes together to form the secret country of Wakanda, which is meant to protect the vibranium from anybody who wants it. However, one tribe known as the Jabari resent the Black Panther's rule and decide to isolate themselves in the mountain. This entire event brings us up to 8,000 years ago. This brings us to 5000 BC, in which a group of 10 Eternals arrive on the planet Earth in order to protect the planet's life, so that the emergence of the celestial Tiamat can eventually happen on the planet of Earth. In 2988 BC, the first convergence, or the last convergence, happens. This is an event where all 9 of the different realms across the cosmos end up coming perfectly into alignment. This includes Asgard, Jotunheim, Earth, and all of the 9 realms. One tribe known as the Dark Elves wants to use a mysterious ancient sludge known as the Aether to corrupt all 9 realms and turn them into darkness. The current king of Asgard, named Bor, ends up leading his Asgardian army into battle against the Dark Elves, where they are eventually able to steal the Aether and hide it in a place where Malekith, the main leader of the Dark Elves, can never find it. Due to their plan being failed, Malekith and the rest of the Dark Elves go into hibernation and end up hiding themselves from the Asgardians so they can never find them. This brings us to 2000 BC, in which the in which a alternate realm from the 616 main universe is Ta Lo, this universe where this tribe has learned to live amongst dragons. However, a being known as the Dweller of Darkness and his soul suckers end up coming to this realm, where the soul suckers are able to suck out the souls of different people in this universe and end up giving them to the Dweller in Darkness to feed. The people of this universe, of this realm, however, are able to get the Dweller in Darkness and his soul suckers locked behind a dragon-scaled gate, which can only be opened by a being of immense power. In 1260 BC, this brings us to the main events of our first project, the main events of Eyes of Wakanda Episode 1, the events in which Nani, a Wakandan warrior, ends up going on a mission to retrieve a soul and vibranium from a man called the Lion, and eventually, upon her return, she ends up becoming the director of the War Dogs. This jumps us later to 12,000 BC to the second episode of Eyes of Wakanda, in which a man named Bakai ends up infiltrating the battle of infiltrating the Trojan War in order to get another piece of vibranium tech, and ends up coming into confrontation with Achilles. This brings us to 600 BC, in which Odin, by this point, has officially become the king of Asgard, and he decides he wants to be a more conquering king. So him and his daughter, Hela, the goddess of death, end up deciding to start conquer all of the various realms. This brings us to 575 BC, where the Battle of Babylon happens, where the Eternals protect the city of Babylon from a bunch of deviants. After the events of this, the leader of the Eternals, named Ajak, contacts the head of the Celestials, named Erishim, and pleads for the Earth to be spared, but he says that he can't do that. She ends up confiding the reason for their mission in Icarus, who is the only other one who knows. She encourages Icarus to live his best life, and so he confesses his hidden feelings to another Eternal named Circe, officially starting their relationship. This then brings us into 400 AD, if you want to include that, where eventually Circe and Icarus get married, much to the disapproval of another Eternal who was in love with Icarus, named Sprite. Now we jump to 800, in which an ancient group known as the Chafa end up getting locked inside a cave, and they would have died. However, one of them, the leader of the Chafa, end up getting special powers that she uses to protect her people. In 959, Odin finally decides he wants to be a benevolent king and stop conquering, so he stops. But his daughter Hela is unable to stop. Odin tries to banish Hela, but it doesn't work, causing him to send out his army of Valkyrie warriors to go after Hela. Hela ends up killing all of them except for one. This eventually allows Odin to banish Hela to Hell, a non-permanent banishment, however, as she will end up coming back only after Odin dies himself. This then later jumps us to 965, in which the frost giants of the realm Jotunheim decide to invade Tonsberg, Norway on Earth. Odin ends up leading the Asgard warriors against the frost giants, and they end up in a huge battle where eventually Odin is able to procure the source of their power, known as the Casket of Ancient Winters. Odin also comes into possession of the leader of the frost giants, Laufey, his son, who Odin decides to take under his wing, who eventually becomes Loki, the god of mischief. This jumps us forward to 1200, in which a tribal match takes place between the Choctaw tribe and the Cherokee tribe for the land they live on. However, one of the members of the Choctaw tribe who participates in the tribal match is able to mysteriously use the powers that the Chafa used all those years ago to protect her people. This jumps us forward to 1400, where the third episode of Eyes of Wakanda happens, in which Basha, a War Dog agent, is able to steal a vibranium tongue from the mountains of China, but he is pursued by Jorani, an old Iron Fist. The two are eventually able to work out their differences, and they end up going their separate ways. This jumps us to 521, where the Battle of Tenochtitlan takes place. The Eternals are participating in this battle, and they actually learn from Ajak that they have eliminated all of the deviants on the planet Earth. Ajak then convinces all of them to go off and live their lives. One of the Eternals, however, Thena, has contracted something called Mad Weary, where she ends up going mad and she has no idea why. Gilgamesh, another one of the Eternals, disagrees to look after her to make sure she doesn't cause any damage. Another Eternal named Druig is disgusted by the fact that humanity is always in conflict with one another, as the Eternals have been specifically instructed to not participate in human affairs unless deviants are involved. Druig, however, goes against this and decides to use his powers of hypnosis to take control of all the warriors to form a society with no conflict whatsoever. The rest of the Eternals split to live their lives. This brings us to 571, in which a village in Spain in Mexico has been having some tough times, and one woman ends up falling severely ill. She looks for a solution, and she eventually finds a version of the heart-shaped herb from a vibranium meteorite that also happened to land in the Spanish waters. She ends up taking this heart-shaped herb with a bunch of her people, which turn them into underwater people, turning their skin blue and giving them gills. However, she is also pregnant at the time, and she eventually gives birth to a child who is actually the first mutant, being able to breathe on both land and in water, and he also has wings on his feet that allow him to fly. Eventually, after his mother dies, the child takes his mother to the surface to bury her in her hometown, where he eventually finds that English conquistadors Spanish conquistadors, however, have taken over his village and enslaved the people that live there. The child, however, continues his mission to bury his mom and ends up killing killing everybody. One of the people in this attack ends up calling the child El Sino Sin Namor, or the child without love. The child ends up adopting this name as his name Namor, or no love, as he has no love for the human surface. Now we jump forward to 1693, where Agatha Harkness, a witch who covets her own survival over the survival of her coven, ends up on a witch's trial where her own mother and her own coven try to execute her. However, Agatha ends up employing some ancient magic she knows, where when she is blasted by the magic of the others, she is able to absorb their powers and their life force. This jumps us forward to 1750, where Agatha ends up giving birth to her child Nicholas. While Nicholas is originally supposed to be taken by Rio Vidal, aka Death, Agatha pleads for her to give them time. Eventually, this leads to 6 years later to 1756, where Agatha has spent a ton of time with Nicholas, and the two of them have developed a legend out of a walking song they have created called The Ballad of the Witch's Road. A legend where any witch who walks the road will get their greatest desires, but in reality, it's a trick for Nicholas to lure in witches for Agatha to steal their powers. However, one night while Agatha is sleeping, Death eventually does come back and take Nicholas with her. Agatha ends up in such a rage, she ends up using the Ballads of the Witch's Road for centuries to lure more witches in order to get their powers to become the most powerful witch in existence. This leads us to 1868, in which Judge Ravonna Renslayer and Miss Minutes, two TVA agents, end up arriving on the sacred timeline in 1868, in which they give a TVA handbook entailing all of their secrets about all their technology to a young Victor Timely. This actually causes Victor Timely to diverge into his own separate timeline, creating a whole new universe. However, at the end of Loki Season 2, after Victor Timely is given closure at the TVA, he is returned back to his normal timeline as a simple candle maker. This leads us to 1883, in which Tuklo, another member of the Choctaw tribe, uses her and protects her father's land using her father's gun. However, she also is able to use the powers of Chafa to do it as well. This leads us into 1896, where we come to the main events of the last episode of Eyes of Wakanda, in which two more Eyes of War Dogs try to steal a vibranium axe that was stolen from Wakanda. However, they decide to eventually put it back due to a warning from the future that it must remain where it is. Upon returning to Wakanda, they make up a lie that they couldn't find it, and the vibranium axe will end up going missing for centuries due to it. Now we jump to 1936, where we come to meeting Captain Steve Rogers and his best friend Bucky Barnes. Shortly after Steve's mother's funeral, Steve is in a little bit of a slump and he's walked home by his best friend Bucky Barnes. Steve ends up telling Bucky that it doesn't need his help, but Bucky decides to give it to him anyway, saying he's with him till the end of the line. This jumps us forward to 1942, where Johann Schmidt, a man who has received a dangerous level of super soldier serum from a man named Abraham Erskine, founds a Soviet terrorist group known as Hydra, a group that is taking over World War II and trying their best to assert dominance against the world. He, however, also learns of a secret thing that was hidden from a secret powerful object which is hidden in Tonsberg, Norway. It is the Tesseract, a hidden object from Odin's trophy room that he left in Tonsberg, Norway after the battle of Tonsberg against the Frost Giants. Johann ends up breaking into a church in Tonsberg where he steals the Tesseract and ends up killing everybody in the town. This then also in 1942, a group of clandestines or Jinn are banished from their home realm of the Nord dimension, while they end up desperately trying to find a way to return home. And while they're looking through a tomb, they are able to discover a mysterious bangle that might help them. However, due to the war, they are separated, and one of the clandestines named Aisha ends up meeting a man named Hassan, in which she falls in love with and ends up having a child with. This brings us to our first full MCU movie on the list, where we come to Captain America: The First Avenger, which starts in 1943, in which Steve Rogers is finally able to enlist in the army thanks to Abraham Erskine. He is given the super soldier serum and turned into Captain America, where he starts fighting Hydra, which jumps forward to 1945, in which during the mission on the train, a mission on a train trying to receive Zola, Bucky ends up falling off of the train where he is presumed dead. Steve then goes on to find the Hydra's hideout where he fights Red Skull. However, in order to stop the Valkyrie plane that they are on from bombing the United States, Captain America drives the plane into the ice of the Arctic in order to stop it from exploding. However, he is frozen in the cockpit of this plane for almost 70 years afterwards. This then leads us to, also in 1945, the events of Hiroshima, where one of the Eternals, Phastos, ends up blaming himself for the incident due to his fact he always wants to push humanity to be more than it is. This leads to the events of Hiroshima, and he heavily blames himself, with Ajax showing up to tell him it's not his fault. This then jumps us 1 year later to 1946, where we come to the main events of Agent Carter, in which, after the events of the war, Peggy Carter has returned to being a simple decoder at the U.S. A simple decoder, but she ends up, after receiving a decode, she goes on a mission to retrieve the thing the code talks about, and afterwards she is chewed out by her boss, but then she is picked up by Howard Stark to become the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. This jumps us forward to 1947, where the partition of India happens. Aisha is trying to get her family out of India when she is ambushed by Najma, one of the other clandestines who wants the bangle to get home to the Nord dimension. However, Aisha has decided to stay in this dimension and has given the bangle to her daughter Sana to protect it. However, after Sana is separated from her father, Aisha uses the last of her powers to summon Kamala Khan, her great-granddaughter from the future, who helps Sana get back to her father by leading her with a trail of stars. Kamala Khan is then returned to the present. This jumps us to 1971, in which, after losing a bet with Thor, Loki is sent to Earth, where he poses as a plane hijacker known as DB Cooper. He tells the plane that he has a bomb, and before he can be apprehended by any police, he jumps off of this plane, where he is picked up by the Bifrost, only leaving behind some money that is later found by humans. Jumping forward to 1972, a young Carol Danvers is on a beach with a bunch of friends when she eventually falls over due to playing volleyball. However, she doesn't stay fallen over, and she ends up standing right back up. In 1973, we meet a young Wilson Fisk who is living his life as a child, and his father, Bill Fisk, is actually running for mayor. However, he takes out a huge loan from a gang that allows him to fund his campaign. However, when he loses his campaign, the gang he took the money from want their money back. Bill is unable to present this, and he ends up getting angry at his wife, who had been warning him for years for months that this would happen. When Fisk ends up taking it too far and starts beating up his wife, young Bill Fisk ends up beating in his father's skull with a hammer to protect his mother. They end up spending the next week getting rid of the body piece by piece. In 1974, this is when the last Stark Expo is held, and this is when Howard Stark ends up recording a bunch of videos showing off his City of Tomorrow, and eventually leaving a hidden message to his son Tony Stark that he has created a new element that he hopes Tony will discover someday. Then we jump forward to 1977, where a TVA hunter known as XO5 has decided to abandon his post at the TVA to live on the sacred timeline as an actor named Brad Wolfe, who stars in a movie called Zaniac. However, he is tracked down by Loki, by a variant of Loki, and a TVA agent, Mobius, who track him down and end up bringing him back to the TVA. In 1978, Carol Danvers ends up having some more falls, where she ends up getting in a go-kart crash, and she ends up falling down during a game of baseball. However, like last time, in the same instance, she doesn't stay falling down, and she decides to stand back up. In 1980, Ego has grown a lot since the last time we saw him, and he has discovered his purpose in life, the expansion, where he will plant seeds of himself in multiple different planets that, when activated, will turn the entire universe into him. However, he doesn't have enough power to make this happen, so he needs to find a second Celestial. So he ends up falling in love with multiple different species, trying to procreate another Celestial that he can use. However, it doesn't ever really go to plan. Eventually, Ego arrives on Earth to plant his seed in Earth when he falls in love with the Meredith Quill. The two of them end up seeing each other three times before Ego ends up realizing he's become distracted. So he ends up planting a tumor in Meredith so that she will die, so the Ego can leave and get on with the expansion. Meredith also becomes pregnant with Ego's son, Peter Quill. This jumps us to 1981, where we meet Taloa, another woman from the Choctaw. We meet Taloa, who is another member of the Choctaw tribe and another carrier of the Chafa power. This jumps us to 1984, where a group of sisters from a church decide to abandon their church and go to a wrestling match. One of the members, Maggie Grace, is actually asked to assist Jack Murdoch in his boxing match. The two of them end up falling in love at this event. Similarly, across the world, the McCleaver crime family ends up meeting with the Stokes crime family in 1985 in order to talk about various different things during their meeting. However, at the end of this event, the Stokes end up setting fire to the cabin that the McCleavers are staying in, killing all of them except for one, Bushmaster. In 1985, a year later, the Grace and Murdoch have actually had a child named Matthew. However, Grace ends up suffering from some post-birth depression, and so decides to leave the Murdochs and head back to the church with Father Lantham. In 1987, a young Cornell Stokes end up making friends with a man named Donnie. However, Mama Mabel doesn't really approve of Donnie, and so decides to murder him, and so decides to have Pistol Pete murder him. Similarly, we end up having later this exact same year, one of the McCleavers that ended up escaping the fire a couple years earlier, John McCleaver, is actually attacked by Pistol Pete as well. And then, similarly later this year, Pistol Pete is actually found guilty of breaking the one Stokes family rule, family comes first. Mama Mabel then encourages Cornell Stokes to murder Pistol Pete. And then, similarly, in the exact same year, the Soviets end up launching a missile at the United States. S.H.I.E.L.D. ends up sending in one of their operatives, Hank Pym, who has been operating as Ant-Man during the time of the Cold War. Hank is actually encouraged by his wife, Janet Van Dyne, to join him on his missions, so Janet ends up taking up the persona as the Wasp. During their mission, during the missile, they have to try to get inside the missile to deactivate it, but they end up can't getting through. The only way to do it is to go subatomic. Hank's regulator is damaged, so Janet makes a sacrifice to deactivate the missile. However, she ends up lost in the quantum realm due to that. And then also in 1987, we also have Peter Quill has been born by this point and ends up spending quality time with his mom Meredith, listening to some of her favorite music on on his Walkman, where Meredith also makes a tape for her known as Awesome Mix Volume 1. Jumping forward a year to 1988, we end up finding that Colonel Stokes has joined a gang, or formed a gang with a couple people known as Pop, and he ends up getting his nickname here as Cottonmouth. Also in 1988 is when Meredith's tumor officially takes over her body and Meredith actually dies. Peter Quill is so distraught at this event, never gets a chance to say goodbye to her, and runs out into the field outside the hospital, where he is abducted by Yondu and the Ravengers. Yondu is actually hired to take Peter to his father Ego, but after Yondu learns what Ego has done to every single one of his other kids, Yondu decides to keep Peter, keeping him under the false pretense that he's keeping him around because he's small and can get into places the adults can't, so he's good for thieving. In 1989, during one of Hank's missions, he ends up discovering that S.H.I.E.L.D. is trying to recreate the Pym particle after Hank has locked it away after losing his wife. Hank gets officially mad at an older Howard Stark and Peggy Carter, where he officially quits S.H.I.E.L.D. Similar to this year, the Kree Skull, the two races of aliens have come into conflict with each other, the shape-shifting Skrulls and the Kree Empire. One of the Kree has learned the false tense that the only reason that they're at war with the Skrulls is because the Skrulls won't submit to the Kree's rule. The Kree lady Marvel ends up going to Earth to try to get hands on the Tesseract to use it to create a light speed engine to get the Skrulls far away from the Kree. However, the Kree find her and end up attacking her and her test pilot for the day, Carol Danvers. Carol decides to destroy the Lightspeed engine, but in turn absorb the Tesseract's power, gaining incredible abilities. The leader of this mission, Jan Rog, ends up taking Carol back to Hala, the Kree Skrull world, where they brainwash her into thinking she's a Kree soldier who was given her powers because she thought she was ready, and she becomes a Kree warrior. Also in 1989, we have a sweet moment where Yondu ends up teaching a young Peter Quill how to use blasters and teaching him generally how to defend himself. And this also leads into the Ravengers having their first where Peter wants to bring some Christmas cheer to the Ravengers, where he ends up trying to teach them the tradition. Yondu, however, scoffs at this moment and wants them to get rid of it. Gets rid of it, however. However, something that Kraglin doesn't see is that Yondu ends up eventually coming into liking the Christmas tradition, as Peter got him a really sentimental toy that Yondu likes to collect. So Yondu ends up getting Peter Quill his signature double-barreled blasters. This brings us to 1990, where we end up learning the backstory of Willis Stryker and how he has and how his parents end up having some affairs and all that lead to Stryker being the brother of Carl Lucas. However, Willis Stryker never really feels welcome into the family. This leads us to 1991, where Howard Stark has come extremely close to replicating the super soldier serum that was previously used on Steve Rogers. However, Hydra wants this super soldier serum, so they deploy Bucky Barnes, who has officially become the Winter Soldier by this point, to assassinate both Howard and Maria Stark and steal the serum, which they later used to create 5 more Winter Soldiers. However, they are kept in frozen isolation, much like Bucky. In 1992, Elaine Foster ends up dying of cancer, and we see this dark shot of Jane Foster, her daughter, looking over her grave with a thing of flowers. Also in 1992, we learn the dark past of the dark childhood of a woman named Krista, whose father jumped out of a window and took her with him. She ended up surviving, but ended up causing a lot of trauma later in life. Then we jump to also in 1992, where we have the prologue of Black Panther, where N'Jobu, the Prince of Wakanda, ends up helping a man named Ulysses Claw to steal a bunch of vibranium from the country. Claw is able to get away, but due to N'Jobu's friend Zuri turning him in, the King of Wakanda and current Black Panther T'Chaka, also N'Jobu's brother, comes after him and ends up actually killing N'Jobu. However, when they leave, they do not know about N'Jobu's son Eric Stevens, who ends up learning about his death of father and so swears revenge on Wakanda. In 1994, we end up having the flashbacks where a young Matt Murdock, in an event to save a man, ends up doused in dangerous chemicals that turns him permanently blind. He ends up struggling. His father ends up struggling to try to care for Matt as Matt's blindness becomes a problem for him. But when Matt's blindness happens, his other senses get incredibly heightened, like his hearing. During his hearing, Matt actually learns that Jack Murdock actually intentionally loses his fights because his benefactor told him to. Matt ends up encouraging his father to win his next fight, but when he does, his father is murdered, turning Matt into an orphan. This brings us to 1995, where while Matt is staying at the orphanage, he's having a lot of troubles, in which he is put in touch with a man named Stick, who ends up teaching Matt about the fact that their blindness isn't a curse, it's in fact a gift. And Stick also teaches Matt in the ways of martial arts. This brings us to the main events of Captain Marvel, in which during a battle with the Skrulls, Carol Danvers, who's now going under the alias of Veers, ends up crash landing on Earth, where she meets a young Nick Fury. Together, they uncover Carol Danvers' past and Carol is able to overcome her Kree programming to turn on the Kree to help the Skrulls. Carol decides to leave the Tesseract in Fury's hand, and Fury gets the idea that they're going to need more enhanced individuals to protect the Earth when time comes, and he ends up naming this initiative after Carol Danvers' call sign, Avenger. Then shortly after the events of this movie, Carol actually returns to Hala, where she actually permanently destroys the Kree, destroys the Kree's supreme intelligence, turning Hala into a barren wasteland. Shortly after this, while Stick has been training Matt for all this time, during one of their training sessions, Matt decides to give Stick a bracelet that he created out of the wrapper from the ice cream that Stick bought them on the day of first bet. Stick, realizing that Matt says that Matt is not ready to be one of his warriors, as sentiment makes him vulnerable, and so Stick abandons Matt. Similarly, in 1985, in Ohio, we have the fake family, where a family made up of Alexei Shostakov, Melina Vostokov, Natasha Romanoff, and Yelena Belova is posing as a fake family in Ohio and under the Red Rooms programming, so that Alexei can steal some files from SHIELD. However, they are eventually caught, and they move back to Russia, where Natasha and Yelena are put through the Red Room program, the Red Room's Black Widow programming. Then, in the same year, we also have Ava's accident, where an old ally of Hank Pym was fired by him, and so tries to replicate his technology. However, it goes incredibly wrong and kills both him and his wife. However, his daughter Ava ends up surviving, but her particles end up disconnected from reality, turning her into a being that can phase through matter. She eventually is picked up by SHIELD and becomes an assassin for them named Ghost. She has agreed to be an assassin under the pretense that they will find a cure for her, a cure SHIELD never intends to make. Jumping forward to 1996, a man named Wen Wu, who has been ruling a organization known as the Ten Rings for years, has discovered the secret village of Ta Lo, so decides to go find Ta Lo. However, he is stopped at the door by a woman who he eventually falls in love with. The two want to live in Ta Lo, but they are turned away by the elders, causing the two of them to return to the outside world. And the woman ends up losing her connection to the dragon that gives her the power to do a move that actually was able to stop the Ten Rings. Also in 1996, Stick ends up finding his next young soldier, Elektra Nashitos. She ends up being way more promising than Matt Murdock, and so Stick ends up training her to become his most trusted warrior. Also in 1996, we have the young children Mark and Randall Spector, who while their family is at a barbecue, Mark and Randall decide to go into a cave. However, a bad rainstorm ends up coming in and the cave ends up flooded. Mark is able to escape, but Randall drowns, causing Mark to blame himself. This is also when, on a distant planet far in the reaches of space, we first meet Thanos, who has begotten a mission in his mind where his original home planet of Titan was was reaching the brink of collapse. And he proposed a solution that they kill off half of the population so that the resources can last longer. His people don't take this option, and so Titan ends up dying out and becoming a barren wasteland. Thanos adopts this personality to go to every single planet and kill half the population to further its resources. While he is adopting this planet, he ends up meeting a young Gamora, who he ends up taking a liking to, and so adopts to and makes Gamora officially a daughter of Thanos. Then we also have the same years when Randall Shiva is held by the Spectre family, but Wendy is not really able to forgive Mark for Randall's death, and so ends up creating a divide between the two of them. This brings us back to Carl Lucas and Willis Stryker, who Carl Lucas ends up having this dream of being a one-day professional boxer, and so Willis Stryker agrees to train him. In 1997, we meet up with the Walker family, who thanks to extreme amounts of pressure and pushing is able to get the daughter of the Walker family, Trish, is able to get a job on a show that she's even able to get the name changed to create her own nickname, Patsy, creating Trish Walker's first official role in Hollywood as It's Patsy. In the same year, we also meet up back with the Skrulls, as Nick Fury has agreed to let the Skrulls stay on Earth, and as long as they agree to be his spies for S.H.I.E.L.D., while him and Carol Danvers try to find a world that's suitable for them. A young child by the name of Gravik arrives on Earth at this time and agrees to work for Fury under his pretenses. This jumps us to 1988, where finally Wenwu and his wife are married at the Ten Rings compound. This jumps us to also in the same year where Matt Murdock has been still having a bunch of struggles at the church orphanage, and he is given a talking to by Father Lantham. Similarly, in 1998, this is also when Fury ends up meeting up with a Skrull named Vara, where the two of them drink coffee, and the two of them eventually fall in love, turning Vara into eventually Fury's wife. We jump forward to 1998, where after years of being tortured and abused by Wendy, Mark eventually forms DID, or Dissociative Identity Disorder, where Mark ends up creating two alternate personalities. Stephen Grant, based on his favorite character from his movie, and another character named Jake Lockley. Also in 1998, we end up meeting the Maximoff family, where after a long day at work, Wanda Maximoff and Pietro Maximoff and the rest of the family are enjoying a night watching sitcoms, which is apparently their daughter Wanda's favorite thing to do. However, a missile ends up hitting the household, killing both of the parents, leaving only Pietro and Wanda alive. However, the missile doesn't actually go off thanks to Wanda accidentally activating some of her dormant Scarlet Witch powers. However, while they are currently buried under the rubble, they see the name on that missile, Stark Industries, and so develop a hatred for Tony Stark. This is also the same year where Wenwu has his first child named Shang-Chi. This brings us to the New Year's Eve party of 1999, where Tony Stark is hanging out with his love interest, Maya Hansen, and he also runs into a man named Aldrich Killian, who wants to pitch an idea for a company he has to Tony Stark. Tony tells him he'll meet him at the roof at midnight. However, he doesn't show up for that event, which causes Aldrich Killian to form a hatred for Tony Stark. While hanging out with Maya Hansen, Tony ends up learning about Maya's research into a thing called Extremis, for a thing that can actually cause things to regrow limbs, and it could be a lifesaver in the medical field. Tony gives her the secret to actually figuring out Extremis' powers before leaving her the next morning. This brings us into the year 2000, where we first meet up with the Jones family, who while on a family drive ends up getting in a bad car crash that ends up killing both the father and the son of the family, but the daughter and the mother are actually survive and are taken in by a company known as IGH, who end up experimenting on the two of them, turning them into super strong superheroes. However, the mother, named Aisha, is a little bit hard to control. She has violent outbursts and that, so she is chosen to keep at the facility. However, Jessica Jones, her daughter, is able to be freed. She is adopted by the Walker family, mainly just because the the mom of the Walker family believes that it'll boost Trish's reputation in the industry. While Aisha is actually told that that her entire family is killed, while Jessica is told that her entire family is killed. This brings us to 2001, where while on a plane flight to a mysterious conference, the Rand family ends up in a terrible plane crash that only Danny Rand survives. Danny Rand is actually then found by the people of the mysterious village of Kunlun, where he is then brought in by their people and trained as one of them. Jumping forward a little bit to 2003, we end up finding that Wenwu ends up having his second child, known as Xiao Schling. Similarly, in the same year, Danny Rand ends up bringing some fun to Kunlun, where he ends up teaching one of the children's Davos about fun and games, and shows him the fun of making paper airplanes. And we jump over to 2004, where we finally meet Karen Page, who ends up having a seemingly normal life with her family before she accidentally makes a crucial mistake, where while she is drunk driving, she kills her brother, which causes her to actually flee her town, thanks to being pushed away from her town by her father. Also in 2004, the Bucky Barnes, or the Winter Soldier, is actually deployed to the Hotel Anessa to murder a man who he doesn't know at the time. He would later become the friends of the father of that man. This brings us into the same year as 2004, where Davos decides to give up his training to play a game with Danny Rand. However, he is then later punished by his mother. Similarly, in 2004, Mark Spector has finally had enough of his mother's abuse, and so decides to officially move out, much to the protest of his father. Jumping forward to 2005, where we have Trish Walker releases a music video for herself called I Want Your Cray Cray, much to the disdain of her half-sister now, Jessica Jones. Jessica ends up working as the bartender at a bar that is showing the music video, where she gets mad at Trish, but she also then finds a love interest in another bartender named Sterling Adams. The two of them end up forming a bond over Jessica's powers, where Jessica ends up robbing a store to steal the leather jacket that goes on to be her iconic outfit. Similarly, at this same time, Aisha ends up learning that Jessica is actually alive, so she escapes IGH in order to watch Jessica from afar. In next event, we end up meeting back up with Bruce Banner, who is experimenting with the idea of bringing the super soldier serum back to life, and he believes that gamma radiation is actually the hidden ingredient in all of it. And with a lack of resources and money to keep going, he decides to test his theory on himself, which unfortunately unlocks a hidden monster inside of him known as the Hulk. We then returned back to Jessica Jones, where while Alyssa, her mother, is scoping out at Jessica, she finds out that Sterling Adams is actually going to try to sell Jessica to these gang he owes money to try to get money. However, Alyssa ends up killing Sterling Adams, but ends up fleeing before Jessica can see the event, causing Jessica to never trust anybody ever again. Alyssa then returns to IGH and agrees to never leave again until they can fix her violent outbursts. Similarly, the same year, Matt Murdock ends up starting college, where he ends up becoming best friends with his roommate and later business partner, Franklin Foggy Nelson. Then, similarly, during his college year, Matt ends up meeting Elektra Nashitos, eventually falling in love with her, and the two of them end up forming a bond. However, eventually, Elektra is able to track down the man who killed Matt's father, and when Elektra brings Matt to him, expecting Matt to kill him, Matt decides not to. Shortly after, Elektra actually returns to Stick to reveal that it was a setup, and Stick sent Elektra to see if Matt was ready, which they believe Matt is still not ready. This brings us to 2006, which takes us back over to the Ten Rings compound, where the Ten Rings family ends up playing Dance Dance Revolution together. Jumping forward a little bit more in 2006, this is when Shang-Chi's mother actually tells him the story of Ta Lo and gives both him and his sister mysterious necklace gems. Then shortly after, jumping a year again back into 2007, we reach the event where a rival gang of Wenwu ends up attacking the Ten Rings compound and killing his wife, causing Wenwu to go on a violent rampage to go after this gang, putting the Ten Rings back on for the first time in years. However, he also decides to put Shang-Chi through his training regimen to turn Shang-Chi into a warrior, keeping Xiaoxiling far away because he doesn't want a woman part of his organization. Then we jump over back to America, where a man named Pilgrim ends up confessing his sins to his wife, who ends up fully accepting him for who he is. Then we also have a group of Russians known as the Ranskahov brothers, who escape a Russian prison and decide to head to America in order to become kings in their eyes. In the same time, we have the Lopez family, who Maya Lopez is spending a sleepover with a friend, and they really want some sweets. So her mother takes the two of them on a drive to go get it, but they find out that the brakes in her car were cut, and they end up in a bad car crash that ends up killing the mother and ends up making Maya Lopez lose her leg. Due to her father now realizing they're in danger, he decides to take Maya and himself back to New York City to be part of his gang, the Tracksuit Mafia, in order to not harm any of the other people on his wife's side of the family. This then cuts to Maya end up spending her first day in a non-deaf school, which she finds very difficult for her. This then also leads to the High Evolutionary, who is a man who lives in space who wants to create the perfect species, and so he steals a bunch of Earth creatures and starts trying to create the perfect species. He eventually creates Batch 89, a group of creatures who is eventually a group of creatures who end up bonding over their captivity, eventually giving names to themselves: Lila, Teefs, Floor, and Rocket. And that brings us to the end of part 1. We have now officially reached the end of 2007, and join me next week where we will venture into part 2, the Infinity Saga, covering everything from where we ended all the way to Avengers Endgame.